being curious and assuming you don't know what's going on, and maybe even acting a little bit like an idiot in regards to not knowing anything, sometimes is the best way to keep a conversation going. Welcome to How to Beat Social Anxiety and Master Conversation. I'm Adam Lane Smith. Now, social anxiety comes from a lot of different sources. The ones we're going to look at today specifically are not knowing what to talk about, fear of how to respond to questions, and feeling like you will fail a performance while you're trying to talk to people. Now, you can beat this kind of social anxiety by knowing how to keep a conversation going perfectly. And I mean any conversation. If you're in line at the grocery store and someone wants to talk to you, if you're spending time with relatives, if you're out with a loved one, this is the way you can do it. And I'm going to show you how to make effortless conversation that isn't going to leave huge gaps where you're uncomfortable. Conversations, to start with, should not be driven by you talking. Conversations should be a shared experience between two people getting to know each other. And the people love to talk about themselves. Because of that, you need to learn how to get people talking about themselves, and the conversations will be much easier for you. Now, how do you do that? Well, I went to graduate school. I call it therapist school, where I got a master's degree in psychology and then went on for 3 years of apprenticeship as a therapist. We have to get people talking for an hour, at least. An hour back to back to back to back, sometimes for 10-hour shifts. 10 hours of talking every day. And it was my job to keep people talking. And I did it. How? There's a very specific method that therapists are taught. It's called motivational interviewing. That's one of the big pieces. And there are so many different topics within motivational interviewing that you can look at. We will be looking at a few of them today, and some that stray outside of motivational interviewing too. For example, learning how to open conversations. When you ask somebody, how was your week? Odds are good. The first thing they're going to reply with is something that's on their mind the most. That's really what's going to get them the most. They're going to say, oh, I was doing this and this and this, and something in there will clue you in about what was really, really important for them. So how do you get that rolling? Well, you use openings. You say, how was your day? How was your week? How has this past week been for you? These are really simple. They sound like bland openings. And they kind of are, but they're targeted, specifically asking not about the weather, not about what have you been up to, not about how are you. It's asking, how has your week been, your whole week, not the last 5 minutes. It's important to give a range of things because they will actually stop. When someone says, how's your day going? We're all programmed to say, oh, it's fine. But when you say, well, how has your week been? Most people will actually stop and think about it. How has my week been? That is your cue to jump in and say, okay, well, tell me about some of those pieces if they bring something up. If they don't, if they just say, yeah, it's been bad. Yeah, it's been good. Yeah, it's been okay. Yeah, it's been great. Then you jump in and say, really? What made it great? What sticks out to you? Ask a question about what they just said. Questions are key. You should not be doing most of the talking in your conversations. And again, that's where a lot of social anxiety comes from is, what am I going to talk about? How am I going to keep thinking of topics? And it's not that way at all. You should ask one big initial opening question. How was your week? Or how is your business going? Or whatever you might know about that person. And then say, what makes it that way? If they give you a one-word answer, it's going good. Why is it going good? What sticks out to you? Just what sticks out to you. And you don't have to start saying, hey, I demand that you give me information. No, you say, what sticks out to you? What makes it that way? The first thing after that they probably mention is what has been the highlight of their week. They're going to say, well, I had this meeting with so-and-so. That tells you that they've been thinking about that meeting all week. That's what stuck out to them. So they are emotionally tagged into that meeting. Something about that meeting was so important that it jumped out at them first. And usually there's an emotional tag to it. Stress, hope, whatever it might be. That's what they're waiting for. What you want to do is then ask about that. Say, oh, tell me about that meeting. That right there is a good enough question. Tell me more about that. What was that like? Why was that meeting important? Ask about that meeting. Pay attention to the pieces of things that they mention. The pieces in these conversations are what's absolutely crucial for maintaining constant flow where you have an effortless conversation for an hour. You listen. You ask a question, and then you ask branching questions off from that question based on their answers. So they might say, I had a really important meeting in the middle of the week. Oh, what was that about? It was a business sponsor. Oh, and then you have all kinds of questions. What kind of business sponsor? What kind of business are you doing? What would sponsoring look like? What was that? How did that meeting go? Was there any good answers? Any good news? Any difficult news? A million questions you can ask from that that'll keep them going. What you're really looking for, though, are the big ones at first, when you first start out in the conversation, the big ones. So if someone says, oh, it was a rough week. Why? What made it rough? What stuck out to you? Well, my mom called me earlier in the week when I was playing video games. She made me feel really awful. Get curious about the other person. Start asking them questions. Keep them talking. You should not be making statements. You shouldn't be coming up with things saying, oh yeah, that reminds me of my mom. You should be able to say, yeah, okay, that makes sense. The point is to keep the other person talking. So you need to get really curious. Some questions that you could ask. Figure out if this experience they had is normal for them. In the case of the mom, you would say, wow, that's really unfortunate. Does your mom do that a lot? That sounds like a yes or no question, but that can branch off into other things. Because then you could say, why? Why is always a great question. Being curious and assuming you don't know what's going on, and maybe even acting a little bit like an idiot in regards to not knowing anything, sometimes is the best way to keep a conversation going. Be curious and ask, does this happen a lot? And why? Figure out also what gaps the other person is not mentioning. If they're talking about their mom a lot, just remember that most people have two parents. So you can say, wow, is your relationship with your dad like that too? Does your dad do that? You can go as formal and informal as you want. And then follow up on mentioned interests. Once you've tapped out the mom area and tapped out the why and tapped out their life story about their family, talk to them about their dad, and let's assume that that takes up about 10, 20 minutes of conversation or however long, depending if you're not a therapist. Then you go into branching off into other things that they've talked about, branching questions. Hey, you mentioned back there during that conversation, you mentioned video games. Do you like to play? What games do you play? What genres? You can branch off from there. Find new pieces that they mention, and then ask another question. Maybe they also mention a sibling while they're answering about their dad. Ask about their sibling next. Does your sibling act like that? Are you guys on good terms at least? Do you have a good family? Something like that. It sounds like you're getting a little too personal, and it could be if you're asking someone at the grocery store about their father. But if it's someone you actually care about, great. And remember that they're the ones who answered this question and brought up this topic in the first place. Everything that you are asking them is branched off of what they said. Notice at no point did I say you should be thinking of questions and asking them about family members. You are only asking them about things that they have mentioned. That's the whole key to this thing. So it's really difficult to go too personal as long as you stick to what they've mentioned. Now, another question can branch off of some of those things. Maybe asking about the genres of games they like, why they like those genres. Get curious. Be a scientist. Be a little interested about the other person. Why is a great question. Why is a fantastic question because it's not a yes or no answer. Why demands at least a couple of sentences. And usually the person wants to explain themselves pretty well, so you're probably going to be talking for a while. And they probably, during that why, will mention other things in their life as a basis of that reason. There's another chance for branching questions from there because you can ask them about that too. Always be asking questions. Statements are dead ends in these conversations because you're relying on the other person to carry that conversation completely on their own once you make a statement. If they say, yeah, I had a difficult week, my mom called me and she played while I was playing video games, she was yelling at me, and you say, wow, that's unfortunate. Or, yeah, I love video games too. That ends the conversation. The vast majority of awkward silences in conversations come from statements. It's okay to make a statement here or there as far as, hey, yeah, I love video games too. What do you play? It has to be followed up by a question. Always end your part of the conversation, each piece, with a question. If you end your part of a conversation with a statement, it's probably going to fall flat. Unless the other person is a massive extrovert and is really good at carrying the conversation and is really motivated to keep going with that conversation also. Statements are the end. Questions, continue. And asking a lot of questions makes the other person feel like you are really, really interested in them. This is a great way to grow your relationship with the people around you and make them feel loved and cared for. Now remember that they might ask questions too, especially if they're good at conversation. They might have studied motivational interviewing, or they might be really good at it, or they might just be really naturally gifted at communication. Whatever it might be, other people are likely to ask you some questions, even if they're just being polite. If you're going to be asking most of those questions, their questions shouldn't be completely out of the blue. They're probably going to be asking you for your answers to the same questions that they just answered back to you. So you might say, wow, that was unfortunate about your mom. Let's talk about your dad. Let's talk about this other thing. Let's talk about video games. What games do you like to play? What genres do you like to play? And they explain all that to you, and then they realize they've been talking about themselves now for 10, 15 minutes, and they might say, well, you said you like games too. What do you play? Follow those questions by giving answers similar to the ones that the other person just gave you. Roughly the same length, probably a lot more, and roughly the same levels of detail, maybe a little bit less. Don't talk endlessly about your hobbies without pausing for breath, because the other person probably doesn't want to listen to all of that. If they did, they'd be talking about it instead of asking you about it, and their answers would have gone on and on and on and on and on. So stick to about their length, maybe a little bit less. Share so that they learn about you. Sharing that information, volunteering it, also makes the other person feel that you trust them. It makes them feel that you want to connect to them. If you just say, yeah, I'm fine, yeah, I like video games, and then you go into another question, then they will start to feel interrogated. When you're not giving any information back at all, or being extremely brief, it makes the conversation a little bit uncomfortable because they feel like it's only about them, or that you're just forcing conversation. Answer just a little bit. Just a little bit. Yeah, I do like video games. You can mention whatever genre they mentioned to you. I also really like that. And then mention something about it that makes you like it. That gives them a chance to ask you some branching questions too. So maybe then you follow it up with an additional question. Maybe after you say what you just mentioned, you say, my favorite video game is X. What's yours? And why? And you follow it up that way. That why question will really get the other person going. Open-ended questions are always better than yes or no questions. I think answers, most of us know this, but a lot of us fall into this trap. Always try to get questions and answers that are going to be more than yes. Are you having a good time? Yes. That's awful. Yes and no is also, it's probably the second biggest reason the conversations fall really flat. After that, what you're looking for is why. If you ask a yes or no question and the other person says yes and it falls flat, why? Try to follow it up with a why if you can. Or a tell me about that. Just a general invitation to elaborate. If you're really lost, go back to something else that they were really excited about and ask a question to keep them talking. Hey, you mentioned this earlier and you seemed really interested. I'm kind of interested in that. Can you tell me more about it? Remember a time in the conversation they were talking a lot and jump back to that topic. If they were excited in the first place, they'll probably be excited to go back to it. Just ask for more information. That's fine. You don't have to get elaborate and figure out why you need information. Just say, hey, I'm interested in that. I've always been interested in that. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? That sounded pretty cool. That'll do it too. Most people love to talk about themselves. If you can master this process, most people will love it and you'll be able to carry on conversations endlessly. The polite ones will want to know a little bit more about you, so be ready to share a sentence or two each time they ask a question, then turn it back around and ask them, what about you? And that is how you master conversation.